Welcome and bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And
Amen.
please know that I will not be able to see you if you are talking. You'll have to just, maybe if you raise your hand through the Zoom, I might see it. Otherwise, just interrupt me and I will stop. Okay. So we're on to Shlishi, and I've been focusing mainly on the Rashis, obviously, in this particular section. So now we've gone through the counting of the Israelites, the setting up of the Israelite camp. We've moved on to the Levites and their particular tasks. We've set them up as a separate entity within the Israelite camp, and now there are results that are going to come from having this organization, and that's what this chapter is going to start talking about. And some of the issue is arcane. It's classic arcane stuff, which I'm very happy to talk about if you feel you need me to do any more talking about these things. We've talked about them already. And that is the issue of purity, spiritual purity, and spiritual impurity. You'll see. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So God, Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, Tzav et b'nei Yisrael. Command the children of Israel, Vayishalchu min hamachaneh, that they should send out of the camp. Kol tzarua, anyone who is has leprosy. So these are things we discussed in Leviticus. Someone who's a leper. V'chol zav, this is also something we discussed in Leviticus. Someone who has a flow, whether it's a man or a woman, v'chol tamei lenefesh, and anyone who is impure by reason of a soul. That's what it says. That's the literal translation.
So
Yes.
I just want to point out that Chabad says with a male discharge. It doesn't say male or female, but I don't know why they do that. I'm not saying that that's a good translation of the Hebrew. I'm just saying that's what it says on the Chabad translation.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm going to take the next verse and let you, when we get to the next verse, because we've got a Rashi to do on this.
Also, not a soul. I've got a corpse.
Yeah, it's
again.
Right.
I was translating.
Exactly.
Happy to hear these. I'm just simply translating literally so that you can get the benefit of Rashi's interpretation. I'm very aware of it. Okay, but it means literally. It means impure of soul, or by reason of a soul, or for a soul, something like that. The word la, the preposition la, can suggest any of these particular things. Okay, so impure by virtue of a soul or an individual.
and here it says contact with the dead, but yeah,
Again, they're interpreting. They're interpreting.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. So
these are interpretive translations.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So I want you to have the benefit of a literal translation as well.
Yep.
So here goes. Tzav et b'nei Yisrael v'gomer. Command the children of Israel, etc. Parsha. So Rashi starts off with sort of some general statements about this. Parsha zo, this particular section, ne'emara beyom hukam hamishkan. This was actually told, Moses was commanded this on the day that the Mishkan was set up. Ushmona parshiot, and there were actually eight different topics, ne'emru bo bayom, that who told him on that very same day. He was given 8 different topics, commands that came up on the day that the Mishkan was set up. And he says his support is, excuse me, keteita, as is found b'Masechet Gitin, in the tractate of Gitin, b'Perek HaNizakin. Okay, in the chapter that starts off with HaNizakin. Generally, that means those who are injured, something like that. Page 60. And now he gets into the actual interpreting of the verses. They need to send out of the camp. And he explains, Shalosh, in fact, there were really Shalosh Machanot Hayu Sham. There were actually 3 different encampments, B'Sha'at Chaniatam, at the time when they would encamp. So he's now going to tell us how the Israelite encampment was set up. First of all, Toch HaKlaim, within the curtains, and the curtains here we're talking about the courtyard of the Mishkan, right? The curtains that delineated the space that the Mishkan was going to occupy. Hi Machane Shechina. This is termed as the camp of the divine presence. Machane Shechina. Chaniyat HaLeviim, and where the Levites, the encampment of the Levites, Saviv, was around about it. So imagine to yourselves a rectangle, okay? And then around that's delineated by the curtains of the tabernacle that delineate the courtyard. And then right around that, okay, are the 3 Levitical families. And then at the entrance of that courtyard are Moses and Aaron and their families. I'm just telling you that. Kamo Shemafurash, as is specified, as is explained, but Parshat Bamidbar Sinai, in the Parsha of the first Parsha of this book. So we skipped it, but it's there. Hi Machane Levia, and that is known as the Levitical encampment. By the way, just to remind you, I think we've talked about it, that the word Levi, Levaya, means to accompany. That's essentially what it has to do with. And so the Levites were the ones who, when Leah originally named her son Levi, she said she named him Levi in her expressing her desire that her husband, that Jacob, accompany her, that his joy in seeing how she had born him a son would give him a cause to accompany, to be with her more. And now there's a different context here, because they would accompany the priests, and of course accompany the temple and the Mishkan, etc. Umisham. So now we have that encampment. Umisham ad sof machane hadgalim, and from that point until the edge of the encampment of the flags, literally, or the banners. And of course, we're talking now about the 12 tribes, the other 12 tribes, each one of which was identified by a banner on the 4 cardinal points. L'chol arba haruchot, at each of the 4 cardinal points. He Machane Yisrael. That would be considered Machane Yisrael, the encampment of the Israelites. Hatzarua, so now he explains, somebody who was leprous, Nishtaleach Chutz Lekulan, that person had to go and live outside all these encampments. Hazav, one who had a flux, Mutar b'machane Yisrael, was permitted in the encampment of the Israelites, Umeshulach min hashtayim, but he could not enter into the other 2 encampments. He was not allowed to enter the camp of the Levites, and certainly not the camp of the Shekhinah. So we're looking here, obviously, at degrees of holiness. Degrees of holiness.
But
yeah,
I don't get it. Don't all men have, and I guess maybe women too, but have these infrequently? And does that mean they always like have to get, if they're were in one of the other camps, they'd have to leave their home and go to this camp, or do they have to just stay in this camp all the time? And I would think that would be true of all men.
So I think we need to understand, we're not talking about a nocturnal emission here, and we're not talking about engaging in intimate relations. We're not talking about that.
So what are we talking about?
Azav is more like gonorrhea. It means an uncontrollable flux. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, as I said, a nocturnal emission.
So, that answers most of my question. One more part of it is that then,
Sure.
if they if the leper or the person with the flux becomes
Mhm.
cured, can they go back home? Or
Absolutely, absolutely. I would absolutely. I mean, back in Leviticus, we read about the rites that they would go through in order to, once they were cured of their physical problems, they then were given an opportunity to perform certain rites and ceremonies that would then allow them to reintegrate into the camp. So, again, this comes into the whole issue of these various particular diseases, if you want to call them that, that are mentioned in Leviticus, and the whole issue of what the spiritual purpose of disease is. I'm at a point in my life where I see these kinds of things because I'm doing it through the filter of a loving God, that they are trying to teach us something. They're helping us try to learn some valuable lessons about life, and maybe try to force us to start to look inside ourselves and do tshuva. That's the purpose of this, and possibly to be accountable, to recognize just how accountable we are for our behaviors. So that's how I understand these, and then the idea of going in some notion of sequestration, I think, is also important in that process. That we can get very distracted. People who have very active social lives. I'm not saying it's. I mean, it's an unfair generalization, I suppose. But when you're involved with other people a lot, and if you're taking care of your responsibilities and things like that, it doesn't give you the freedom to reflect and to think. So I don't know that we necessarily need to see this as a punishment. Some of these things we recognize may be seen as a punishment, but possibly they're not. They're actually an opportunity for some quiet time, relatively quiet time. And here we go, just to finish this up, the tameh lanefesh. Okay, this is the point, right? The one that the phrase that we were analyzing a little bit before. One who is impure to a soul, Mutar. So such a person, and we'll define what that is in a moment, he is allowed af b'shel levaya. He's also allowed into the Levitical camp, ve'eno mishulach, and he is not sent out ela mishel shchina. The only area he is not allowed to enter is into the shchina, the area of the shchina. And incidentally, I, the truth is that anyone, it seems to me, and it may be that I just need to do more studying and more research about it, is that essentially when you are in a state of impurity, and by the way, this particular state of impurity is like considered avi avot hatuma, the absolute great granddaddy of impurity, because there are degrees of impurity, as we already kind of touched on. So let me keep going. There's a little more Rashi here. Right. V'kol zeh darshu rabotenu min hamikraot. And all this information our rabbis interpreted, they learned it out from the scriptural verses, the Masechet Pesachim, in the tractate of Pesachim on page Samach Zayin, that's 67. Tameh lanefesh, right? So now he gets into it. What do we mean by tameh lanefesh? The misa'av, here we go. He's actually using the Targum right here. One who is impure, that's the Aramaic for tameh, litmei nafsha, and that's the point about this, because this sounds awfully like tameh, right? And it's spelled almost exactly the same. And an aleph and a yud are relatively interchangeable, certainly from Aramaic to Hebrew. So does it mean impure? Or maybe he'll explain nafsha de inasha, and that means of a human being. So he explains that tameh here is from another Hebrew word, which is etzem. And he says, Omer Ani. Rashi very seldom does this, but here he is venturing his opinion. And I think, Shehu Lashon Atzamot, that this tameh here has this Aramaic word actually is referring to bones. Atzamot Adam, bones of a human being. Belashon Arami in Aramaic. So it could be, I think he's going this far, I'm going to take a chance on this far, that he is actually suggesting that the Hebrew is actually Aramaic at that particular moment. Now that is not unusual. I mean, it doesn't happen frequently, it happens very seldom, but it's not the first time this has happened. We also see Aramaic back in Genesis, where they quote some Aramaic words there. And of course, you know where Abraham came from. You know, Abraham and Sarah originally came from Aram and Naharaim, meaning Mesopotamia, which is where they spoke in Aram. Guess what they spoke? They spoke Aramaic. V'harbe yesh b'Bereshit Rabbah. And there are many examples in Bereshit Rabbah of this word tameh, right, or tameh, in Bereshit Rabbah, meaning bones. Okay. So, for example, there's a reference to Adrianus, Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, who was the emperor at the time. Well, I'm not sure if he was, certainly around the time of the destruction of the temple. Shachik, meaning crushed, Tamya, saying they're cursing Hadrian. They're saying, Hadrian, may his bones be crushed. Shachik, sorry, let's go on here. Yeah, Atzamot, right. So he's translating the Tamya as may his bones be crushed. It's a curse. So that's how we understand that we are talking about impurity by virtue of being in contact with a corpse. And later on, of course, in Bamidbar, in Parshat Chukat, we will discuss specifically, the Torah will get into a serious discussion of many of the laws involved with contact with, it's called Tumat Mate, and that has to do with impurity by virtue of a corpse, essentially, is what it's talking about. So why do we need to do this? Well, what's interesting is that because the camp is now arranged in delineated portions, there's an associated level of holiness with each one of these encampments, which is why it was so important for Rashi to delineate those encampments for us. Now, any questions before I go on to the next verse?
Oh, because animals don't have souls. And
Correct.
they will be in contact with those bones all the time.
Correct. They do not have
Right.
human souls. They do not have human souls. Animals do have souls. They just don't have human souls. And
Right.
yes, excellent point, Golda,
Mhm.
as to why. Now, listen, you
That
can.
makes perfect sense then.
Yes, it does. Now, of course, you can get impure by an animal, but it won't be tumat mate. You can become impure from handling a nevela, an animal that is not properly slaughtered. You know, again, back in Leviticus, it talks about certain animals that render you impure, or certain situations that involve an animal that will render you impure. But it's not the level of impurity that we're talking about here. So,
Well, I
yeah.
guess I have a question related to that, but that's kind of sidetracking where we're going. So I guess let's
Okay,
not.
let's hold it just for a moment, because I
Yeah.
want to make the point which is relevant to what you had said earlier about saying males, right? Here it says explicitly, mizachar ad nekeva, whether male or female, tishalechu, you shall send them out. So it's true, you know, a zav is a word that's related to male, but it's also zava. Zava is a woman who is having a flux, okay? And not only that, we know that there are times when the Torah or Hebrew will use a male noun to include women as well, that it uses male to include female too. So at any rate, here it says, you know, whether male or female, you shall send them forth. El michutz lamachaneh, outside the encampment, tishalchum, you shall send them. And of course, while it says machaneh in singular, having read Rashi, we understand that each one of those different categories of impurity refers to a separate camp. Now here's the thing. Velo yitamu et machanehem. So that they should not render impure their encampments. Asher ani shochen betocham, inasmuch as I dwell among them. So it's
How many days, Rabbi, how many days do they have to stay outside the camp? And when do they become pure again to go back to their,
very,
you know?
very good question,
Oh.
Harlan. So it depends, because they're showing physical manifestations with regards to a person who is tamei lanefesh, who is impure on account of contact with a corpse. What they would do is essentially we're looking at 7 days, essentially a week, as long as they go through this process of purification that involves the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer. Okay.
Oh,
All right. So as
don't they
long as
have
they
to
went
wash
through,
their, don't they have to wash their clothes and bathe?
yeah. I mean, and when they say bathe, they mean go to the mikveh. That's what they understand. That's how tradition understands bathing in this particular case.
But does the red heifer exist?
Nowadays, it doesn't.
No, it
Nowadays, it
doesn't
doesn't.
Oh,
today.
okay.
But I can tell you that I have heard stories, and Shira Beth may have heard of these as well, of children that are being raised in such a way that they never come in contact with a corpse, so that they would be pure enough to work with a red heifer were one to be discovered. And I believe there have also been, whether it's urban myth or not, that there have been cases where a red heifer has in fact been born. Not often, obviously.
If we're impure, do we have to go to the mikveh? The mikveh?
Okay, so essentially, you're asking a complicated question. The only place where the mikveh is a mitzvah, is still a mitzvah, has to do with menstruation and women performing that particular, going to the mikveh at the conclusion of their menstruation. But in terms of men going to the mikveh these days, since we don't have a temple, and we're told clearly in this particular verse that the reason for the necessity of this kind of sequestration has to do with the divine presence being in the camp. And there, by the way, there's also this whole subject of ritual impurity is a huge, huge subject. It actually encompasses one complete order of the Mishnah, and there's 6 orders in the Mishnah, and it just pops up all over the place.
Because my question, which is related to that, and again, you don't have to get into it, but has to do with the fact that when we wash our hands,
yes,
ritually before we daven or before we eat, whatever,
right,
that we're supposedly purifying ourselves.
correct.
So if we have to do that several times a day or whatever to daven or to say a motzi, then I guess we're saying then we're impure in between those times, whether we've contacted, menstrual blood or a corpse or not.
Okay, so it's a different type of impurity. In Masechet Brachot, they discuss this hand washing, etc. There's a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about it. It's one of the last chapters in Masechet Brachot where they talk about, washing your hands at the mealtime. Let me stop the share right now, and so I can see you all. All right. Essentially, and I think this is terribly important, the rabbis didn't, just because the temple was no longer existent, they realized the potential of Judaism and the whole, this whole notion that the Torah was trying to carry was now in jeopardy. This whole idea of developing your life in such a way in relationship to Hashem was in jeopardy. And certainly the way the Torah defined it and the Bible defined it. And so they developed ways in which to preserve the essential purpose, the essence of what was going on. And so there were people who would observe what we could call rabbinic impurity. And they certainly discuss the distinction between impure biblically and some of those things have been mentioned. I mean, tumat mate is still a biblical level of impurity, but there were also ways in which one might contract rabbinical impurity. And so by having those categories and making human beings, making Jews aware of those categories, it was a way of keeping alive a lot of the dynamics in life that would have been part of life when the temple existed, so that they could sanctify, so that people could still have a sense of sanctification of their lives. It was very, very important. A lot of this is rolled up in terms of immortality as well, by the way. And so that you can see Judaism, a dynamic in Judaism that says we earn our immortality, that we have the tools by which to earn our immortality through ethical living, through righteousness, through compassion, through devotion and loyalty to God and the Jewish people. That there are many, many ways in which we have an opportunity to try and earn immortality. And we have
Well,
ways in which we can get rid of it. We can live life for today, and that's the end of it.
yeah. Rabbi, after a funeral, when you go back to your house, there's
Yes,
water out there. You have to wash your
right.
hands. Why?
Correct. Okay, so again, I believe this is a minhag. It's a custom. And again, it's to be able to make a transition from the cemetery, which is essentially the land of those people who've passed away, the land of the dead, into the land, and to transition back into the land of the living. And so washing hands is a way of purifying yourself as you leave the one land and go to the next land. I'm sure there are probably better explanations than the one I've just given, but that's my understanding. So I'm going to stop the recording, and